In June 1943, lost in the vast Pacific Ocean, I, Louis Zamperini, fought for my life in a small inflatable raft. Captured by enemy forces, I began an intense journey of endurance and survival. Childhood and the Olympics. I was born in Olean, New York, but grew up in Torrance, California. I was a troublesome boy, always getting into trouble, stealing cakes or running from the police. My family, Italian immigrants, faced a tough life, but it was in this environment that my indomitable spirit was forged. My childhood was full of mischief and rebellion. If something could be stolen, I stole it. If it could be climbed, I climbed it. My mother was always worried, not knowing where I was or what I was up to. But everything changed when my brother Pete saw my potential. He took me to the running track, where I found my purpose. Running, I felt an unprecedented freedom. The track became my sanctuary. I trained seriously, and soon my name appeared in the local newspapers. At 19, I was selected for the Berlin Olympics in 1936. I ran the 5,000 meters. I didn't win, but my final lap was so fast that it caught Hitler's attention. He wanted to meet me, something I will never forget. After the Olympics, I returned with a new dream: to break the 4-minute mile barrier. I trained tirelessly, believing that nothing was impossible. Then, World War II began. The flame of athletics extinguished and the flame of patriotic duty ignited. I enlisted in the Air Force and was trained as a bombardier. The discipline of running proved invaluable in military training. Facing the tumultuous skies of the Pacific required a courage I didn't even know I had. My bombing missions took me to unimaginable places, flying over enemy islands and facing anti-aircraft fire. Each mission was a game of Russian roulette, but I was determined to survive and serve my country with the same determination I had on the track. During this period, my spirit was tested. I understood the true meaning of resilience and perseverance. The war shaped me in unexpected ways, preparing me for the greatest challenge of my life, facing death and testing the limits of my strength and will to live. War and shipwreck. The sun shone intensely in the May sky of 1943. I boarded the B-24, known as Green Hornet, for a rescue mission over the vast Pacific Ocean. The tension in the cabin was palpable. We were men accustomed to danger, but that day felt different. The mission seemed cursed from the start, with mechanical problems haunting the Green Hornet. But we had no choice. We had to take off. As we flew over the endless blue of the Pacific, an unsettling silence fell over the cabin. Suddenly, I felt a strange vibration beneath my feet. The sound of the engines turned into a deafening roar. Panic gripped me. The engines were failing. Every second dragged on as the plane rapidly lost altitude. The radio crackled with shouts and desperate orders. All I could do was cling to my seat, bracing for the inevitable impact. The impact was devastating. The Green Hornet crashed into the ocean's surface with brutal force. I was thrown violently against my seat. Everything around me turned to chaos. The aircraft's fuselage began to break apart, and the icy Pacific water flooded the cabin. Our bomber turned into a watery tomb. The screams of my crewmates mingled with the sound of twisting metal and bubbling water. The world was falling apart around me. I struggled to free myself from the wreckage. My movements were slow and heavy in the cold water. My lungs burned. The need for air was overwhelming. With a desperate effort, I managed to surface, gasping and coughing. Around me, the wreckage of the Green Hornet floated like sinister monuments to our crash. I saw familiar faces, some panicked, others already motionless. I clung to a floating piece of the fuselage. My mind whirled in a maelstrom of shock and despair. I looked around and saw Sergeant Francis McNamara, Mac, struggling to stay afloat. With a joint effort, we managed to reach one of the life rafts that had miraculously broken free from the plane. But this initial victory was brief. We soon realized we were adrift in a vast water desert, with no food, no water, and no idea if anyone knew we were alive. The fight for survival had only just begun. Every minute, every second, became a battle against despair and impending death. The vastness of the ocean around us was overwhelming. The reality of our situation began to set in. We were lost in the middle of the Pacific, with only our will to live to keep us going. That day in May 1943 marked the beginning of an ordeal that would test the limits of my physical and mental endurance in ways I could never have imagined. survival at sea. The moment we realized we were adrift in the middle of the Pacific, a profound silence took hold of us. The first days were a constant struggle against hunger, thirst, and the scorching sun that seemed to burn us to the bone. Each dawn brought a new wave of despair. The heat was relentless, turning the raft into a boiling pot. We felt our skin dry and crack under the sunlight, while our stomachs growled with hunger. Thirst was an unbearable torment. Our cracked lips bled, and our mouths were like arid deserts. We tried everything to find some relief, even drinking seawater in desperation, only to discover it made us even thirstier. Our bodies grew weaker, and our minds more desperate. Every day was a battle to find food and water. We used pieces of fabric as makeshift nets to catch fish, but luck was rarely on our side. Occasionally we managed to fish, and those moments felt like miracles. We ate the fish raw, each bite a temporary relief from our desperate hunger. Sharks were a constant threat. They swam in circles around the raft, their fins slicing through the water like sharp blades. I remember one day when a shark lunged at the raft, nearly tipping us into the water. With adrenaline coursing through us, we used anything at hand to fend them off, knowing that if we fell into the water, we would be devoured. Catching rainwater was our only hope of quenching our thirst. On days when the sky opened up and rain fell, we raised our heads and mouths in gratitude. We stretched pieces of fabric to collect the precious water, drinking greedily and storing as much as possible in cans and flasks. But these moments were rare, and the uncertainty of the next sip of water loomed over us like a constant shadow. Days turned into weeks, and the relentless battle began to take its toll. Sergeant Francis McNamara, our raft companion, started to succumb to despair and exhaustion. Mac was convinced we wouldn't survive and, in desperation, ate all our emergency rations in the first days, leaving us without resources. His mental state deteriorated rapidly, and his body followed suit. One morning we woke to find that Mac had passed away. The sight of his lifeless body, a pale and fragile figure against the fabric of the raft, was a devastating blow. Phil and I were silent, the weight of the loss crushing us. We knew that if we didn't find a way to keep our hope alive, we would end up like him. We held an improvised funeral, releasing his body into the vast, indifferent waters of the Pacific. The ensuing silence was deafening, each of us lost in our dark thoughts. Mac's death was a cruel reminder of our own mortality. Phil and I made a silent pact to fight with all our might, to never give up. Each day became a test of our mental and physical endurance, a testament to our will to survive. Mac's spirit, his struggle and despair remained with us, a constant reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope is the flame that must never be extinguished. The days on the raft dragged on, each indistinguishable from the next, marked only by the change from sun to moon. Our hope of rescue was kept alive by the rare sounds of aircraft engines. Whenever we heard the distant hum of a plane, our hearts raced with renewed hope. We frantically waved our arms, shouted with all the remaining strength we had, trying to catch the pilot's attention. There was one day in particular when the sound of a plane grew closer and closer. Phil and I grabbed our makeshift mirrors and reflected the sun into the sky, creating flashes of light in the hope of being seen. The plane flew straight past, its wings glinting in the sunlight without even hesitating or changing direction. The sight of the plane disappearing over the horizon, taking with it our hopes of rescue, was a devastating blow. Each failed attempt to attract a plane's attention was like a knife driven into our morale. On one occasion, we saw a plane flying so low that we could almost see the pilots' faces. Our raft was surrounded by a cloud of orange dye we had poured into the water, a bright and visible mark in the vast blue of the Pacific. We shouted, waved, and did everything we could to be noticed. For a brief moment, the plane seemed to hesitate, and our hopes soared. But like so many others before, it continued on its way, quickly disappearing over the horizon, leaving us alone once again. The disappointment was crushing, a physical weight that added to our hunger and thirst. Each plane that passed without noticing us was another confirmation of our insignificance in the vast ocean. We felt that the world had forgotten us, that we were destined to perish without anyone knowing our fate. The tension increased with each failure, our minds becoming battlefields where hope fought against despair. There were moments when it seemed easier to simply give up, to let the darkness take us. But in each of those moments, something inside us refused to yield. Perhaps it was the memory of our families' faces, the promise of a future we were not ready to abandon. Or perhaps it was just sheer stubbornness, the pure will to live that kept us fighting, day after day, against all odds. Those days adrift were an incessant test of endurance. Each plane that passed without seeing us was a knife in the heart, but also a cruel reminder that we were still alive, that we still had a chance, however small. And as long as there was a chance, however small, we would cling to it with all our strength. This was the silent pact Phil and I made, an unbreakable commitment to life, even in the midst of a sea of despair. Capture and captivity. After weeks adrift, our hopes were hanging by a thread. We were exhausted, malnourished, and desperate. Then one day, we heard the familiar sound of an engine in the sky. Our hearts raced. I lifted my head and saw a plane approaching. For the first time in a long while, I felt a surge of hope. I moved to the edge of the raft and started waving frantically. Phil did the same, our shouts echoing in the vast silence of the ocean. The plane seemed to have spotted us. It came closer, flying low over the water. But instead of an American rescue plane, we realized with horror that it was a Japanese bomber. The sound of the engines changed, and a new cacophony filled the air, the deafening noise of machine guns. Bullets began to tear through the water around us, violently piercing the surface. Instinctively, we threw ourselves into the water, trying to hide beneath the inflatable rafts. I held my breath, feeling the cutting cold of the Pacific as the shooting continued. I could hear the sound of bullets hitting the rafts, the splintering of torn material. When I finally had to surface for air, I saw the damage. One of the rafts was destroyed, pieces floating around. The other, miraculously, was still afloat but full of holes. Terrified and defenseless, we looked to the sky, expecting another attack. The bomber made several more passes, firing at us, but miraculously none of us were directly hit. Finally, the plane flew away, leaving us in a silence heavy with tension and fear. The attack was over, but the reality of our situation had worsened. After the attack, we knew our situation was dire. Our resources were already scarce, and now, with one raft destroyed, our struggle for survival became even harder. The days dragged on, each more desolate than the last. Then, on a cloudy morning, while we floated aimlessly, we saw something on the horizon. It was a ship. Initially, we couldn't believe it. I moved to what remained of the raft, eyes fixed on the indistinct shape approaching. When it became clear it was a Japanese ship, our hearts filled with fear and resignation. There was nowhere to run, no way to fight. We were completely at their mercy. The ship approached slowly, its enormous sides rising over us like walls of steel. Japanese sailors appeared at the edges, pointing at us with expressions of surprise and curiosity. They threw a rope and we were pulled aboard. Our weak bodies could barely endure the effort. Every movement was agony. Upon boarding, we were immediately surrounded by armed Japanese soldiers. We were searched, our tattered clothes and debilitated bodies a living testimony of our ordeal. The soldiers spoke harshly, pushing us and shouting orders we could barely understand. I looked at Phil, seeing the same fear and exhaustion reflected in his eyes. Our 47 days adrift had ended, but the real test was just beginning. We were taken inside the ship, where our fate would be decided. The relief of being out of the raft was quickly replaced by the terror of the unknown. We were now prisoners of war, and the shadow of the enemy loomed over us like a sentence of imminent death. However, even in that dark moment, I promised myself that I would continue to fight, that I would find a way to survive, no matter what came next. As soon as we were captured and taken aboard the Japanese ship, the reality of our situation became brutally clear. We were greeted with shouts and shoves, our frail bodies falling onto the hard deck. The soldiers searched us, their rough hands exploring every inch of our bodies for weapons or information. Without ceremony, we were dragged inside the ship, where shadows and the smell of oil and sweat enveloped us. In the first days, the brutality of our captors knew no bounds. We were repeatedly beaten, punches and kicks leaving us sore and covered in bruises. The questions came in Japanese, a language we didn't understand, and any hesitation in responding resulted in more blows. The inhumane treatment was a clear attempt to break our spirit from the start. After a few weeks on the ship, we were transferred to the first of many prisoner of war camps. The journey to the camp was long and grueling. our already weakened bodies facing yet another ordeal. Upon arrival at the camp, we were met with a scene of misery and desolation. Filthy barracks and barbed wire fences surrounded us, the air heavy with the smell of disease and despair. It was there that I met Mutsuhiro Watanabe, a sadistic guard the prisoners called the Bird. From our first encounter, it was clear he took a perverse pleasure in inflicting pain and humiliation. His eyes gleamed with a cruelty that chilled me. He singled me out as the target of his wrath, perhaps because of my indomitable spirit that he was determined to crush. Watanabe had a variety of methods to torture the prisoners. One of his favorites was to force us to stand for hours on end without allowing us to rest. My muscles ached and my legs trembled, but I refused to give in. On other occasions, he beat me with his bamboo stick, the blows reverberating through my body like thunderclaps of pain. Each strike was an attempt to break my resistance, but every time I fell, I got back up, determined not to give him the satisfaction of my surrender. He also loved psychological humiliation. On one particularly cruel day, Watanabe made me stand before the entire camp population, ordering each prisoner to punch me in the face. It was a long line of exhausted and starving men forced to hit a comrade. I looked into the eyes of each one, trying to convey strength, silently telling them not to blame themselves. When the last man approached, my vision was blurred and my face throbbed with pain, but my spirit remained intact. Watanabe was not content with just inflicting physical pain. He tried to dehumanize us, to reduce us to something less than men. But even in the darkest moments, I remembered the words of my coach and my family. The resilience I developed as an athlete kept me strong. I repeated to myself that I would survive, that one day I would leave there and tell the world about the horrors I had witnessed. Every day in the camp was a fight for survival, but my determination grew with each of Watanabe's attempts to break me. I knew that my true victory would be to survive, to keep fighting, and to maintain my humanity, even in the face of such cruelty. And so, day after day, blow after blow, I resisted, fueled by hope and the strength that came from deep within me. Freedom and redemption. In the final days of captivity, there was a palpable change in the air. News of the approaching Allied forces and the constant bombings nearby brought a new sense of hope among us, the prisoners. The once relentless guards now appeared nervous and uncertain. There were whispers and rumors circulating through the camp. The war is almost over. The guards began to behave differently. The gratuitous violence and beatings decreased, replaced by a visible tension. Some guards even avoided making eye contact with us, perhaps fearing retribution when the war ended. The prisoners, on the other hand, began gathering in small groups, exchanging information and theories about what was happening outside. Each day seemed to drag on endlessly, and the nights were filled with dreams of freedom. On one of those days, we heard the distant sound of explosions, each one giving us a thread of hope. We knew the Allies were close, and the possibility of rescue became increasingly real. But with hope came fear that the guards, in a final act of desperation, would decide to eliminate us before they could be captured. Then finally, the day we had longed for arrived. I remember waking up to a strange silence interrupted only by the sound of hurried footsteps and shouted orders in Japanese. The guards were in a panic, and we prisoners felt a mixture of relief and tension. I looked around and saw the same question in my fellow captives' eyes. Is it today? The confirmation came shortly after. The guards began abandoning the camp, leaving us to our own devices. When the Allied troops finally arrived, there was a moment of stunned silence before an explosion of joy. Men who barely had the strength to stand now hugged each other, crying and laughing simultaneously. The sight of the Allied troops was like a dream come true, a sign that our long and horrific ordeal was finally over. When the camp gates opened and we were led out by the Allied soldiers, a sense of freedom enveloped us. Feeling the sun on my face without the shadow of barbed wire, walking without the constant watch of the guards, everything felt surreal. Each step outside that camp was a step towards the life we had left behind. We were transported back to the United States, where the reception was warm and filled with emotion. Upon arriving home, I was welcomed by my family and friends, all relieved and overjoyed to see me alive. Despite the happiness of the reunion, it was clear that the journey to recovery would be long, but at that moment what mattered was that we were finally free, ready to begin rebuilding our lives, step by step. Freedom, after so long, was almost overwhelming. Every detail, the sound of cars, the smell of home-cooked food, the touch of familiar hands, was a reminder of what we had fought for and survived. And as I looked into the faces of the people I loved, I knew that, despite the challenges that lay ahead, I was ready to start this new phase of my life, carrying with me the lessons of resilience and hope that I had learned during my time in captivity. Returning home after the war was an indescribable relief, but I soon realized that the true battle was just beginning. Although I was physically free from the horrors of the POW camp, my mind remained trapped in traumatic memories. I suffered from constant nightmares, reliving the tortures and humiliations I had faced. I would wake up sweating and screaming, feeling once again in the cruel hands of Mutsuhiro Watanabe, the bird. Post-traumatic stress disorder became a constant presence in my life. Any loud noise or sudden movement caused me to overreact. My nights were haunted by vivid flashbacks, and sleep became a rare luxury. During the day, I struggled to maintain a facade of normality, but inside I was falling apart. Seeking relief, I turned to alcohol. At first, it seemed like an easy solution to silence the demons that haunted my mind. I drank to forget, to numb the pain that I couldn't express in words. But what started as a temporary escape quickly turned into an addiction that threatened to destroy everything I had achieved. My wife, Cynthia, watched with growing concern as I sank deeper into alcoholism. Cynthia was a beacon of hope during this dark period. She loved me and believed in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself. Her patience and faith were crucial to my recovery. She convinced me to attend an evangelistic crusade led by Billy Graham in 1949. I was reluctant, skeptical, but something inside me knew I needed help. In that revival tent, I heard Billy Graham speak about forgiveness and redemption. His words touched something deep within me. For the first time, I felt a spark of true hope. I understood that to find peace, I needed to forgive those who had done me so much harm. It was not an easy process. My heart was full of hatred and resentment, but I began to realize that this hatred was destroying me from within. I embraced the Christian faith, and with it came a profound transformation. I learned to surrender my pain and suffering to God, finding comfort and strength in my faith. I began to actively work on forgiving my former captors, including Watanabe. Over time, I realized that forgiveness was not for them, but for me. Releasing that burden allowed me to start truly healing. I wrote letters to the prisoner of war camp guards, expressing my forgiveness. In 1950, I returned to Japan, not as a prisoner, but as a free man, full of purpose. I visited the prison where many of my former captors were held, and, face to face with those who had once tortured me, I offered them my forgiveness. I couldn't find Watanabe, but I knew in my heart that I had already forgiven him. My life began to change in ways I had never imagined. I found peace where there had been torment, joy where there had been despair. My story became a message of hope and resilience, showing that even in the most terrible circumstances, it is possible to find redemption and renew life through faith and forgiveness. Today I am a transformed man. The traumas of war and captivity no longer define me. They are part of my story, yes, but they are not the end of it. Through faith, the love of my family, and the power of forgiveness, I found a new purpose and a new way of living. This is my true victory, the proof that the human spirit can overcome any adversity.